I've walked these mountains for 15 years, and I've seen everything from black bears to bobcats, copperheads to coyotes. I thought I knew the Appalachians like the back of my hand, every rustle, every hum, every scent of pine and damp earth. But nothing could have prepared me for the silence. It started a week ago. Not the peaceful quiet of a snowy morning, but a profound, unnatural stillness that felt heavier than the fog that often hangs in the hollows. The rhythmic call of the whippoorwill was gone. The chittering of squirrels ceased. The very air felt dead. Old Man Hemlock, a trapper I sometimes shared a coffee with, once told me that when the woods go completely silent, it means something older than the trees is listening. I always laughed it off, but now, the chill in the air wasn't just the change of seasons. It was the first sign that something was deeply, terribly wrong.
My name is Ethan Shaw, and I'm a park ranger. My post is about 100 miles from the nearest town, deep in a section the old-timers call the Holler. It's a place of ancient trees and twisting, forgotten trails. My mission that day was a routine one. Check on a lone hiker, a man named Henderson who had failed to check in. I radioed in, trying to cut through the oppressive quiet. "Brenda, this is Ranger Shaw, hiker Henderson. Last known coordinates 4322 north, 8418 west. Checking in. Over."
The radio crackled back, thick with static. "Shaw, that you?" "Yeah, I got it. He's 2 days overdue. Probably just a broken phone. Check the designated waypoint. If you don't find him, wait for the search party. We'll send one out in a few days." A few days? I felt a knot tightened in my stomach. "Brendan, the woods. They're quiet. Too quiet. Something's not right out here. Over."
She just sighed. "Ethan, it's just the season. Stay put and don't get lost. Over and out." The static returned. A white noise that felt like a mocking presence in the void of the forest. The silence, that awful, suffocating silence, gnawed at me. My boots crunched on the damp earth, a sound so loud it made me flinch. It was the only noise for miles. I moved with the practiced caution of a man who understands the woods, my eyes scanning the dense undergrowth and the low-hanging branches of the dying oaks. I found no sign of Henderson, but I found something else in a patch of mud near a slow-moving creek.
It wasn't a footprint. It was a gouge in the earth, as if a heavy stick had been dragged along. At the end of the gouge was an impression that made my blood run cold. It was the print of a hand, but not a human one. The fingers were impossibly long and thin, splayed out like claws, and the palm was cupped into a perfect, hollow bowl. The proportions were all wrong, stretched and gaunt, yet undeniably humanoid. I'd seen a lot of tracks in my life, from bear to deer to bobcat. I had never, ever seen anything like this. A long-forgotten folktale about the hand of the Holler flashed through my mind, and I felt a prickle of sweat on my back despite the cold air.
My heart hammered against my ribs, a slow, heavy drum in the profound quiet. I followed the trail. It didn't meander like an animal's path or follow the contour of the land like a man's. It went straight, up the side of a ridge that was too steep to be climbed by any sane creature. I had to use my hands to pull myself up, my muscles burning with the effort. My fingers felt the cold, rough bark of the trees and the sharp edges of rocks as I climbed. When I reached the top, gasping for air, the tracks vanished. I was left alone with the silent trees and a growing terror that felt both ancient and deeply personal.
The dread didn't leave me. I returned to my cabin, a one-room sanctuary that had always been my solace. Now it felt like a cage. The silence followed me, clinging to the shadows and the corners of the room. I tried to tell myself the track was a trick of the light, but then the sounds began. It started as a faint whisper on the wind, like dry leaves skittering across rock, except there was no wind. It was a voice, I realized, but the words were intelligible, twisting into long, drawn-out groans that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. One night, as I sat by the wood stove, the air suddenly grew colder. I could feel the change on my skin, a clammy, unnatural chill. Then a stone pinged against my window. I froze, my hand going for the rifle I kept by the door.
Another stone hit the pane, then another, and another. It sounded like a hailstorm. I grabbed my lantern and threw open the door. The moment I did, the stones stopped. The woods were still, the moon's pale light cutting through the canopy, painting the world in shades of silver and black. I saw nothing, but I smelled something, a mix of wet soil, decay, and a sickly sweet scent, like rotten fruit left in the sun. It made my stomach churn.
The next morning, on my doormat, I found a perfect circle of smooth, white stones. They were all the same size, each one a perfect oval. I knelt, my fingers tracing the cold, polished surface. They felt like enamel. They looked like teeth. My blood ran cold. I knew with a certainty that reached into the deepest part of my soul that whatever was out there, it wasn't just a lost hiker or a wild animal. I radioed in again, a garbled report of unusual activity and my fear for Henderson. The line was dead, just static, thick and buzzing. I had a cold feeling in my gut that Brenda's search party was never gonna come. I was on my own.
I packed my bag, checked my rifle, and grabbed my compass. I had to go back. This time, I wasn't just searching for a man. I was hunting for answers. The strange drag marks from before were gone, replaced by what looked like a series of small, deep holes in the ground, spaced impossibly far apart. Whatever made them had a loping, lanky gait, a stride no normal creature could achieve. I walked for hours, a primal fear of being watched intensifying with every step. It was an old, ancient feeling, not a human one. It felt hungry and cold. I stopped to eat a piece of jerky, and from the trees I heard a high-pitched, mocking giggle, followed by my own name, whispered from the shadows. Ethan. Ethan.
My heart leaped into my throat. I spun around, rifle raised, my heart pounding a furious rhythm. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice swallowed by the trees. The giggling started again, closer this time, and then a faint, shivering rattle, like dry bones clacking together. A wave of ice-cold air washed over me. I didn't see anything, but I looked at the trees. Their bark seemed to stretch and pull, looking like skin drawn taut over bone. Their branches twisted into grotesque shapes that resembled skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. A wave of dizziness washed over me, followed by a profound, aching emptiness that made my stomach clench. I felt a desperate, starving hunger, though I had just eaten. My mind screamed at me to answer, to call back to the voice, but some part of me, a small, terrified voice, told me not to.
I pushed on, faster now, a knot of panic tightening in my stomach. The trail became a muddled mess. I found myself walking in circles, the same moss-covered rock appearing again and again, its familiar shape now a mocking constant in my growing nightmare. The forest was actively trying to confuse and frighten me.
Then I saw it, the thing that had made the tracks. It was in the distance, partially obscured by a stand of pines, and it was watching me. It was impossibly tall, unnervingly thin. Its limbs were like sticks tied together with frayed twine. Its body was bare, stretched skin over a gaunt, skeletal frame. Its head was a skull, not of a deer or a bear, but something far more disturbing, with jagged antlers that seemed to grow not from its head, but from inside it, like they were tearing their way out. Its eyes were two burning coals in the hollow sockets, and from its mouth, a long black tongue licked at the air.
I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs were leaden. The creature took a step forward, a horrifying spectacle of motion. It didn't walk so much as it swayed, its limbs clicking and clacking with every movement. Its whisper, once a distant echo, was now a loud, guttural hiss, a terrible parody of a human voice. It was calling my name. Ethan. Ethan. I remembered the stories, the hushed legends of the old-timers, tales they told by the firelight with fearful tones. They spoke of the Wendigo, a creature born of human starvation and depravity, a spirit that possessed the lost and turned them into ravenous monsters. It was said to be perpetually hungry, its hunger for human flesh, but it would torment its prey first, driving them mad with illusions and fear. Its most terrifying power was its voice, a perfect mimicry that could lure a person to their doom. I had always scoffed at the stories, dismissing them as folklore. Now, standing before the real, horrifying thing, I wished I had listened. I watched as the creature began to move faster, its loping gait bringing it closer with every sickening, clacking step. Its hunger was a physical thing, a cold that radiated from it, a feeling of gnawing emptiness that made my own stomach ache with a desperate need for sustenance.
I finally broke free from my paralysis. I turned and ran, not back toward my cabin, but deeper into the trees, toward an old, abandoned mica mine I knew was a few miles away. The mine was dangerous, filled with unstable tunnels and dark shafts, but it was a place the stories said the Wendigo would not go. It was a place of iron and rock, and the Wendigo was a creature of wood and bone. The woods became a blur of green and brown as I sprinted, my lungs burning, the sounds of the Wendigo's clicks and whispers right behind me. I could feel its breath, a cold, foul wind on my neck. I stumbled over a root and fell, scraping my knee. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain, and kept running. I was close now. I could see the jagged mouth of the old mine shaft, half covered in moss and vines, a dark maw in the side of the mountain. I dove inside, the darkness enveloping me in a moment. I scrambled deeper, not caring about the loose rocks or the precarious timber supports. I was safe from the wind and the whispers, but not from the silence. It returned, colder and heavier than before, filling the space like a physical presence. I held my breath, straining to hear anything. Nothing. For what felt like an eternity, I sat in the darkness. The only sound, the frantic pounding of my own heart. I was alone, but I knew I wasn't. The creature was out there, waiting. It hadn't left. It was just silent. And that was more terrifying than the whispers, more chilling than the clacking of its bones.
I stayed in the mine for 2 days. I ate the last of my jerky and drank the water that dripped from the ceiling, which tasted faintly of iron and rock. I huddled in a corner, watching the faint light from the entrance grow dim and then bright again with each sunrise and sunset. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I was a creature of the light, but the light was where the monster lived.
On the third day, a new kind of hunger gnawed at my own belly, a deep, hollow emptiness that had nothing to do with food. It was a feeling I had felt from the creature, and now it was inside me, a cold echo of its curse. This was how it began. I had to get out. I had to get away from this place before it was too late. I waited for nightfall, when the darkness was complete, hoping it would hide me. I crept to the entrance, a silent, shivering shadow.
I peered out. The moon was a sliver of white in the black sky, and the stars were like scattered diamonds. I saw nothing. The forest was still, the trees silent, the air still and cold.
I ran. I didn't look back. I ran all the way back to my cabin, my legs burning, my lungs on fire. I threw open the door, slammed it shut, and bolted it. I collapsed against the wood, gasping for breath, the fear a living thing in my chest. I looked around my small, familiar room. The wood stove was cold, the radio silent. I was alone.
But as I sat there, I heard a new sound. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a clack. It was a gentle tapping. 3 taps on the outside of the window. A slow, steady rhythm, as if someone was patiently waiting. I didn't look. I couldn't. I knew what I would see if I did. I knew what was waiting for me in the darkness, and I knew it was no longer just in the holler. It had followed me.
I stayed in the cabin for another week, subsisting on canned food, my mind a constant replay of the nightmarish chase. My thoughts became foggy, less and less my own. The tapping never stopped. Sometimes it was on the window, sometimes the door, sometimes the roof, its rhythm always changing, always patient. I tried to radio for help, but the line was dead. I tried to use my satellite phone, but it was just a buzzing piece of plastic. I was trapped. The forest, the creature, the terror, it had all closed in around me.
The final day I could stand it. I was sitting by the cold stove, staring at a patch of moonlight on the floor, when I heard a new sound. It was the sound of a stone, a single, smooth, white stone dropping on the floor. I looked up, my eyes wide. It had come from the radio, the stones that looked like teeth. One by one, they started to fall from the radio, landing with a soft ping on the wooden floor, until a perfect circle of them was arranged at my feet.
I looked up, my eyes going to the one small window in the cabin. I saw a shape there, a gaunt, skeletal face pressed against the glass, its eyes 2 burning coals, and its mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. It was holding a small, smooth white stone in its hand. The fingers were impossibly long and thin, splayed out like a claw. I saw the familiar, terrible cup of the palm. It was watching me. Its lips, stretched tight over a mouthful of impossibly sharp teeth, moved slowly. And in a voice that was a perfect, chilling mimicry of my own, it whispered, "Hello, Ethan. I'm so hungry." I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, watching its face in the moonlight. I don't know how long I listened to its voice, my own voice, mocking me, talking about the gnawing, endless hunger. I do know that the next day the tapping was gone. The forest was silent again. And my cabin, which had once felt like a sanctuary, felt like the loneliest, most terrifying place on earth. I was still alive, for now. But I was trapped, a meal waiting to be claimed, a final, horrifying course in the long, unending feast of the holler.
Elias? Elias, where are you? The voice was a ghostly echo, a breath of cold air that slithered out of the forest silence. It was soft and melodic, the sweetest sound I had ever known, but here, in the heart of the desolate Appalachian woods, it was the most horrifying thing I had ever experienced. It was the voice of my late wife, Claire. She had been gone for 5 years, and her memory was a sacred sanctuary I kept in my heart. To hear it now, whispered from the unseen shadows of the mountains, was the most horrifying thing I had ever experienced.
This was not just a creature. This was a lie, a trap, a twisted echo of my greatest sorrow, and it was calling my name. I'd been a ranger in these mountains for 20 years. I knew their every voice, the cry of a hawk, the rustle of a bear, the gentle hum of summer cicadas. I'd patrolled every trail with Claire before she was gone. We used to sit in silence and listen, her hand in mine, feeling the life of the forest around us. She always said the mountains had a language of their own, and I'd always believed her. But the low, sibilant hiss on the radio a week ago was a language I didn't recognize, a sound like dry leaves scraping over stone, chilling and deliberate.
The dispatcher's voice had cut through it. "Elias, you copy?" "Copy," I'd said, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. "What was that?" There was a long pause. "We're not sure, Elias. It's been happening on and off for a couple of days now, getting clearer." That's when the first missing person report came in. A backpacker named Daniel. Then a second, then a third, all from the same stretch of trail known as Whisper Creek Path. My gut instinct, honed by decades of searching these hills, told me something was terribly wrong. People just don't vanish without a trace. But that's exactly what it looked like. Their campsites were perfectly neat, their gear still there. It was the absence of a struggle that was most unnerving.
I decided to investigate the path myself. As I hiked, a heavy, suffocating silence settled over the woods. Not even the birds were singing. It was a vacuum of sound, an ancient, dead space where my compass and GPS felt like useless relics. That's when the whispers started. Faint at first, they were carried on the non-existent breeze. "Honey, where did you go?" a woman's voice asked, melodic and gentle. I stopped, my heart hammering. I knew that voice. It was Sarah's, a young hiker who had gone missing. Her mother had described her voice on the phone, sweet and kind. The mimic was using it.
I saw it on the mossy ground beside the trail, a small, tarnished silver locket. Sarah's. She never took it off. It was as if she had simply dropped it and walked away, drawn in by a sound too familiar to resist. This wasn't an animal. This was intelligent, deceptive, and cruel. I turned back to my truck, but the voices grew more insistent, more personal. A torrent of them now. Fragments of a conversation. "I'm right here. It's getting dark." And then it came. The whisper I'd been dreading. "Elias! Elias, where are you?" My wife's voice said. The memory of her last laugh, the sound of her humming a quiet song while doing dishes, it was a memory I cherished, a warmth I held on to. To hear it weaponized, twisted by this thing in the woods, was a cold violation.
"Elias, I'm lost. Help me," the voice cried. "It's cold out here. Why did you leave me?" Tears welled in my eyes, a reaction I couldn't control. I wanted to turn back, to call her name, but I knew it was a lie, a trick. This thing was using my greatest sorrow against me, and the realization was more horrifying than any monster I could have imagined. I ran. I stumbled out of the tree line and into the clearing where I had parked my truck. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing. The forest looked serene and beautiful in the late afternoon light, but I knew the truth.
The whispers in my truck were gone, but they were not silenced. They lived on in my mind. For a week, I was a ghost in my own home. Every rustle of a leaf outside my window sounded like a voice calling my name. I couldn't file a report. What could I say? I found a tree that talks and steals souls? I knew they would institutionalize me. I kept my secret. knowing I had to find the source. I had to put a name to the thing that had stolen the sacred memory of my wife's voice.
The whispers in my truck were gone, but they were not silenced. They lived on in my mind. For a week, I was a ghost in my own home. Every rustle of a leaf outside my window sounded like a voice calling my name. I couldn't file a report. What could I say? I found a tree that talks and steals souls. I knew they would institutionalize me. I kept my secret, knowing I had to find the source. I had to put a name to the thing that had stolen the sacred memory of my wife's voice.
Finally, I reached a hollow in the heart of the woods, a place not on any map. In the center of the hollow, there it was. Not a creature, but a living, breathing monument of the forest itself. A twisted, gnarled tree, its bark rippling with the faint outlines of faces. A tapestry of human features woven into the wood. The tree was humming with 1,000 whispers, the voices of the missing, all speaking at once, a chaotic symphony of sorrow and fear and loss. And in the chorus, I heard Claire's.
I stood there frozen as the voices washed over me, telling me they were scared, that they wanted me to stay with them. I could feel the energy of the thing, a seductive lure, a promise of reunion with all the ones I had lost. I saw a faint shimmer at the base of the tree, a phantom image of my home, a glimpse of my wife smiling. The mimic wasn't just a creature. It was a parasitic intelligence that manipulated reality to create the perfect trap.
I closed my eyes, forcing the images away, and reached for the one thing I knew was real, my compass. I ignored the voices and the promises. I focused on the needle, a tiny, unwavering point of truth in a world of lies. I turned around and began to walk.
The whispers grew louder, angrier. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, the path disappearing behind me. The branches of the trees whipped and lashed at my face, but I kept walking, one foot in front of the other, my eyes fixed on the compass.
I kept my secret, becoming a silent guardian of the park's darkest corner. I still patrol these mountains, but I never go near Whisper Creek Path, and I never forget what I heard. The mountains are a realm of beauty and terror, a place where the voices of the lost will whisper forever. But the mountains still whisper, and one day I may answer.
The wind bit at Declan Thorne's face, carrying with it the metallic scent of rain and rot. A storm was brewing over the Blackwood mining area, a forgotten scar on the mountainside that was now a maze of slick rock, abandoned shafts, and a festering swamp at its base. He had 5 people behind him, not counting himself. 5 people who looked at him with varying degrees of trust and outright hostility. They were a search party, but they felt more like a ticking bomb.
"You sure about this, Ranger?" Hank grumbled, his bulky frame wrapped in a stained yellow raincoat. Hank was the local town's self-appointed authority on everything, and his skepticism was a constant low hum of static. That storm's gonna come down hard.
"We're a mile from the last known sighting," Declan said, checking the faded map he had been given. "We don't have a choice. The family wants her back." The missing person was a young woman named Lily, an amateur spelunker who had gone to explore the old mines. She hadn't checked in for 2 days. The storm had made a helicopter search impossible. Ground was all they had.
Behind Hank, a woman named Fiona pulled her scarf tighter around her neck. She was a volunteer from a local search and rescue group, and her eyes were constantly scanning the ground, looking for something to latch onto, a sign of her own expertise. The other 3 were Lily's parents, frantic and desperate. and a young man named Cole, her boyfriend, whose face was a mask of grim determination.
As on cue, the first fat drops of rain hit the ground. A flash of lightning lit up the sky, momentarily revealing the jagged, skeletal remains of the old mine's entrance ahead. The crack of thunder that followed felt like a physical blow. "Let's move," Declan said, his voice flat. He pointed toward a narrow, treacherous path that followed a craggy cliffside, a path that led to the central mining hub and the swampy valley below. "Stay close. This isn't a trail."
The rain became a torrent, a curtain of water that blurred the world. The ground turned to treacherous mud, and they were no longer walking, but slogging. The air grew thick with a bone-deep cold, and the wind howled through the rusty girders of the old mining equipment, a chorus of ghostly groans. Declan saw it first, just a flicker at the edge of his vision, a movement in the rain, a shape darker than the rest of the night. It was gone before he could truly register it, but it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He ignored it. He had to. He was the ranger. He was supposed to be the anchor.
They reached the main mine entrance, a gaping maw in the rock face. The rain was drumming a furious rhythm on the tin roof of a small collapsed shack nearby. The swampy valley, usually just a bog of moss and reeds, was now a swirling basin of mud and angry-looking water. A dense, unnatural fog began to roll in from the valley floor, clinging to everything like a living shroud.
"We're going in," Declan announced, his voice barely audible over the storm. "No!" Cole shouted, his voice cracking. "We need to split up. One group searches the mine, the other checks the valley. She could be anywhere." Declan shook his head. "The rule is we stick together. It's too dangerous to split up, especially with this storm."
"The rule is for people who don't know what they're doing," Cole shot back, his eyes wild with grief and impatience. "I'm going to find her. You can follow your stupid rules all you want." Without another word, Cole broke away from the group, scrambling down a steep, muddy slope toward the valley floor. His mother screamed his name, but he was already a shadow disappearing into the swirling gray.
"Damn it," Declan muttered, but there was no time to argue. The group was splintering before his eyes. He had to make a call. He looked at the parents, their faces pale with shock. He looked at Fiona, her expression grim. And he looked at Hank, his skepticism now tinged with fear. "We follow him," Declan said, making the decision instantly. "He's not safe on his own. We stick together, and we find them both."
As they descended into the valley, the fog swallowed them whole. The world shrank to a small circle of light from their flashlights. The air tasted of decay and something else, something metallic and electric, like blood on a copper wire. The ground beneath their feet squelched, and every step felt like a fight with the earth itself. The fog was no longer just a meteorological event, it was a presence. It shifted and swirled, forming vague, indistinct shapes that seemed to watch them from the periphery of their vision. They were not solid, just suggestions of figures, tall and thin like silhouettes against a gray canvas.
"Did you see that?" Fiona whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Something just moved." Declan turned his flashlight beam, but there was nothing. "It's the fog," he said, but even he didn't believe it. He had seen it too. Hank scoffed. "It's your imagination playing tricks on you, kid. Let's just find that idiot and get out of here." But the shadows persisted. In the shifting fog, the trees themselves seemed to twist and contort, their gnarled branches reaching down like skeletal fingers. The ground, a muddy, root-choked mess, seemed to buckle and writhe under their feet, making a simple step feel like climbing a shifting stairwell.
Suddenly, a gasp from Lily's mother. She pointed with a trembling hand toward a large,
half-submerged log. Lily's bag! That's her backpack! Declan and Fiona moved forward, pulling the sodden backpack from the muck. It was Lily's, no doubt. The small embroidered patch she had on it was unmistakable. But as they examined it, a new dread settled in. The backpack was completely dry inside. The notebook, the maps, even a box of matches were perfectly preserved, as if they had been placed there just moments ago, not after 2 days in a torrential downpour.
That's impossible, Fiona breathed, her professional composure cracking. Everything should be soaked. It should be ruined. Hank shoved a hand into the bag, his face a mask of confusion. It's dry. How is it dry? This whole place is a lake. Declan felt a cold dread seep into his bones. This wasn't just a storm or a lost hiker. This was something else. He looked at the parents whose hope had just been replaced with a new, sharper kind of terror. He looked at Hank, who was no longer just skeptical, but genuinely afraid. And he saw Fiona, her eyes wide, as she looked not at the bag, but at the twisting forms in the fog behind them.
They're all around us now, she whispered, her voice thin. Who? Hank snarled, his fear turning to aggression. Who is? We're the only ones here. But the apparitions were there. Not just shadows now, but indistinct figures. Their forms vaguely human, their limbs too long, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. They moved through the fog with a disturbing, disjointed gait, not walking so much as lurching. It's an illusion, Declan insisted, trying to sound like he believed it. He was the anchor. He had to be.
Then a high-pitched shriek echoed through the valley. It wasn't a human sound. It was the sound of metal tearing, of wood splintering, of something immense and ancient groaning in agony. They all froze, looking toward the source of the sound. It came from the direction Cole had gone. "We have to go," Lily's father shouted, a renewed sense of urgency replacing his initial paralysis. They started moving again, a frantic, chaotic race through the mud. The shadows were closer now, a chorus of dark shapes swirling around them. The forest itself seemed to wake up, the twisted roots reaching up like hands to trip them. The trees bent at impossible angles, their branches scraping against the air with a sound like fingernails on a blackboard. Then, a high-pitched shriek echoed through the valley. It wasn't a human sound. It was the sound of metal tearing, of wood splintering, of something immense and ancient groaning in agony. They all froze, looking toward the source of the sound. It came from the direction Cole had gone. "We have to go!" Lily's father shouted, a renewed sense of urgency replacing his initial paralysis. They started moving again, a frantic, chaotic race through the mud. The shadows were closer now, a chorus of dark shapes swirling around them. The forest itself seemed to awaken, the twisted roots reaching up like hands to trip them. The trees bent at impossible angles, their branches scraping against the air with a sound like fingernails on a blackboard.
But Cole didn't move. He just stood there. And as they got closer, they could see what was happening to him. The rain was washing the mud from his face, but underneath, his skin seemed to be shifting, turning a sickly gray-green color. A dark, jagged vein pulsed at his temple. His eyes, when he finally turned his head to look at them, were no longer the frantic, desperate eyes of a boy in love. They were black and empty, like the mouths of the abandoned mine shafts themselves. "Cole?" Declan said, his voice flat with disbelief. "What happened to you?"
A slow, chilling smile spread across Cole's face, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "She's here," he said, his voice a distorted, gravelly whisper. "She's been waiting, and now she has a voice."
He pointed a finger at Lily's mother. "You want to find her? We found her. She's with us now." Before anyone could react, Cole lunged at his mother, his movements no longer the clumsy thrashing of a human, but the fluid, unnatural motion of a predator. He slammed her to the ground, his blackened hands closing around her throat. Lily's father rushed to her aid, pulling Cole off with a guttural roar.
The group had officially fractured. The search party was now a battleground. Hank, in a panic, stumbled backward, slipping on a muddy root. He fell, his head hitting a rock with a sickening thud. He didn't get back up. Fiona was screaming, trying to pull Lily's mother away from the struggle. Declan, his heart hammering against his ribs, drew the small pistol he carried for wildlife defense. He pointed it at Cole, his hand shaking uncontrollably.
He couldn't shoot him. He was still a person, but he wasn't. Not anymore. The face, the eyes, the unnatural strength. This wasn't Cole. "Let her go!" Declan shouted, his voice cracking with the strain. Cole just laughed. A hollow, echoing sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The smile on his face widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too white.
Then a new voice, a voice like dry leaves scraping against rock, like a dying woman's last breath. "He's with me now, Ranger." The voice came from the large, ancient-looking tree in the center of the clearing, a tree whose bark was twisted and scarred. Its branches, which had seemed menacing before, now actively writhed and coiled. A small, dark fissure opened in the bark, and the face of the missing hiker, Lily, stared out from it. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth a silent scream of agony. She wasn't here. She was a part of it, a part of the forest.
"She chose," the voice said. "She chose to be one with us. And now they all will." The ground beneath their feet began to shudder violently. It wasn't an earthquake. It was the land itself waking up. The roots of the trees began to tear themselves from the ground, lashing out like whips. The mud turned to a sloshing, bubbling mass. The shadows from the fog converged, coalescing into a single, massive form that towered over them, a grotesque mockery of a human shape, its form shifting and dissolving.
Lily's father, seeing his wife in danger, made a desperate decision. He grabbed a loose rock and slammed it against Cole's head. The possessed body of Cole went limp for a moment, and Lily's father pulled his wife away. But the possessed form was already stirring, a dark ooze spreading from the head wound. It was healing. It wasn't a body anymore. It was a vessel. "We have to run," Fiona screamed, her face streaked with tears and mud. "It's not Cole, it's the forest."
Declan, still holding the pistol, knew she was right. He holstered the weapon, knowing it was useless here. They had to get out. He grabbed Fiona's arm and pulled her toward the mine entrance, the only way out of the valley. Lily's parents were right behind them, scrambling and slipping in the mud. The possessed form of Cole rose to its feet, moving with a jerky, unnatural grace. He didn't run after them. He just watched, his black eyes fixed on Declan, a knowing, triumphant expression on his face.
"You can't escape," he rasped, his voice a sickening echo of the forests. "We're already inside you." A new wave of apparitions surged out of the fog. Not just indistinct shadows now, but perfect, detailed forms of people. They were all wearing mining helmets and old-fashioned clothes. The faces were filled with an endless, silent agony. They were the ghosts of the Blackwood miners, trapped and transformed by whatever evil had awakened here.
Declan and the remaining search party scrambled up the muddy slope, the ghosts of the miners lurching after them.
The air was filled with a cacophony of sound. The crack of branches, the sloshing of mud, the low groan of the ancient trees. They made it to the mouth of the mine, the darkness inside a welcome relief from the chaos outside. Declan took a quick head count. Just himself, Fiona, and Lily's parents. Hank was gone. Cole was gone.
The tunnel. The air smells different, Fiona said, her flashlight beam sweeping across the damp, rock-hewn walls. The air was cleaner, colder, and free of the cloying, metallic scent that had permeated the swampy valley. "We can't go through the mine," Lily's father said, his voice trembling. "It's a maze. We'll get lost." "We have to," Declan insisted. "The valley is not safe. The forest, it's alive. It's trying to consume us."
They entered the mine, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive darkness. Declan led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The tunnel was claustrophobic, the walls slick with water. They passed abandoned tools, old rusted carts on rusted tracks, and the occasional sign warning of unstable rock. The silence here was different from the silence in the woods. It was a heavy, dead silence, but it was at least predictable.
They walked for what felt like hours, a tense, silent procession. The parents, once full of hope and desperation, were now just shells, their energy spent, their faces gaunt with shock. Fiona, the professional, was fraying at the edges, her hand constantly on the handle of her knife. Then they heard it, the sound of something dragging along the ground behind them, the metallic scrape of a footstep that wasn't their own. They all stopped, their flashlights trained on the darkness behind them.
"It's not real," Declan whispered, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. "It can't be in here." But the sound came again, closer this time. A new dread, a new kind of terror. This was not the chaotic, swirling madness of the forest. This was a methodical, relentless pursuit. They started running. The narrow tunnel made it difficult to go fast. They stumbled over uneven ground, scraping their hands on the jagged rock walls. The sound of the dragging footsteps was right behind them now, an impossible, maddening rhythm.
Lily's mother tripped and fell. She couldn't get up, her body and mind finally giving out. "Leave me," she sobbed, her words muffled by the stone floor. "Just go! Save yourselves!" But her husband wouldn't. He tried to pull her up, his face a contorted mask of despair. The dragging footsteps stopped. They all turned, their flashlights illuminating the tunnel behind them. Standing there, its back to them, was a figure. It was small, hunched, and wore what looked like a tattered version of Lily's jacket. As it turned, the light hit its face, and they all screamed.
It was Lily, but she was not Lily. Her body was bent at a grotesque angle. Her eyes were milky white and vacant. Her mouth was open in a silent, permanent scream, but no sound came out. The skin on her face was peeling and translucent, revealing the raw muscle and bone beneath. She was a puppet, a vessel, not Cole's possessed form, but something far more horrifying, a transformation. The ground beneath her feet was not there, but an extension of the ground. The walls were not walls, but extensions of her limbs. She was no longer a person. She was a part of the mine, of the rock, of the horror that lived in this mountain. She had become the Whisper.
"Lily," her father whispered, his voice a ghost of a sound. The thing that was Lily raised a hand, and the rock walls of the mine began to shudder violently. Pebbles fell from the ceiling, then larger chunks of rock. The mine was collapsing. "Run!" Declan screamed, his voice raw. They scrambled forward as the tunnel behind them was swallowed by a cascade of rock and dust. Declan, Fiona, and Lily's father made it through, but just barely. They reached a large cavern and they collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. The thud of the collapsing tunnel was deafening.
When the dust settled, they looked back. The entrance they had come through was sealed, a tomb for the thing that had once been Lily and for the darkness that had followed them. They were in a new tunnel now. This one was narrower, steeper, and it smelled of fresh air, not the stagnant air of the mine. It led upward, a faint light visible at its end. Hope, a fragile, terrifying thing, bloomed in their chests.
They scrambled toward the light, crawling on their hands and knees. The tunnel twisted and turned, and they could hear the faint sound of the storm outside. Finally, they burst out into the open air, a new world of gray light and driving rain. They were on the side of a sheer cliff, a narrow ledge, their only foothold. Far below, they could see the swampy valley, still shrouded in the malevolent fog, and at its heart the old gnarled tree seemed to be breathing, its branches pulsing with a dark, unseen energy.
They made it back to the main road, battered and bruised and soaked to the bone. The rescue team was waiting, but Declan knew they were too late. The story they told was a story of a storm, a flash flood, a lost search party. Hank had slipped, Cole had been washed away, and Lily's mother was in shock. Lily was still missing. Declan looked at Fiona and Lily's father. They said nothing. They didn't have to. They knew what they had seen.
The old-timers in these parts, the ones with gray in their beards and the permanent squint of a man who's stared at the sun too long, call the forest a living thing. They say it breathes, that its silence is a deliberate choice, and that the wind rustling through the pines is just its way of whispering secrets. As a ranger with a decade of service under my belt, patrolling the rugged heart of the Monongahela National Forest, I'd always taken that as a poetic description, a way to personify the vast, indifferent wilderness. I knew the forest's rhythms, the chatter of jays, the scent of wet loam and pine resin, the way the light broke through the canopy in the early morning. It was my cathedral, my sanctuary. It was, I believed, knowable. My post was a remote patrol cabin near the border of Braxton County, West Virginia. The nearest town was a good 3-hour drive, a winding, treacherous descent down a dirt road that seemed to actively resent the passage of tires. The cabin itself was simple. A wood stove, a cot, a shortwave radio that was mostly static, and a small porch where I'd drink my coffee and watch the fog crawl up from the hollows like a ghost. My patrol route was a 15-mile loop of forgotten logging roads and game trails, a familiar circuit I could walk in my sleep. I was Patrick Leonardo, and this corner of the world was my domain. It was my way of escaping the city, the noise, the suffocating presence of people and their endless demands. I came here to be alone, to find a silence that wasn't empty, but full of life. I knew the gnarled oak with the bear claw marks, and the hidden waterfall where the trout were fat and lazy. I knew the difference between the snap of a deer's hoof on a dry twig and the heavy footfall of a black bear. This forest, I thought, held no secrets from me.
The change started, not with a bang, but with a whimper, a slow, insidious creep that began a little over a month ago. It was the air, a certain tension in it. The evening cicadas, usually a deafening chorus that vibrated through the summer nights, were muted. Their song became a hesitant hum, a chorus of uncertainty. The rustle of a squirrel in the undergrowth seemed to hold a note of urgency I'd never heard before, a frantic, desperate scrabbling that suggested not a search for nuts, but a flight from something unseen. One afternoon, while checking a perimeter trail, I caught a scent on the wind. It wasn't bear or deer
or decaying leaves. It was sharp and metallic, like ozone after a lightning strike, mixed with something acrid and strange, like burnt sulfur. My rational mind, that fortress of logic built on years of ranger training, told me it was a fluke, a trick of the humidity. The old-timers' whispers, however, echoed in the back of my mind. The forest was holding its breath.
The second sign was the markings. I found them on a stand of red maples near an old spring house. Not claw marks, not deer rubbings, but something else entirely. The bark was stripped clean, not ripped away in jagged hunks, but seemingly vaporized, leaving a smooth, blackened channel in the wood. It was almost perfectly cylindrical, like a branding iron had been pressed against the tree and held there. I ran my fingers over the smooth, burned wood, feeling the unnatural heat radiating from it. The lines were too perfect, too uniform. I circled the trees, a cold dread crawling up my spine. But there were no footprints, no bent grass, no sign of what could have done this. My mind, in a desperate attempt to find a mundane explanation, suggested a strange blight, a new kind of beetle. The answers felt thin, like tissue paper stretched over an abyss.
Over the next few days, the signs became more frequent and less deniable. The ozone smell was now a constant presence, a phantom odor clinging to the damp air, thick enough to taste. The stillness of the forest deepened into an oppressive silence that felt less like a lack of sound and more like a deliberate suppression of it. I felt watched. The feeling was a physical weight on my shoulders, a constant prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I started to carry my hunting rifle with me, a comfortingly heavy piece of steel that I'd only ever used on targets. My once familiar sanctuary was turning into a cage, and I was the prey.
I began to find other things. Piles of dead animals. Rabbits, squirrels, a deer, not torn apart, but drained. The bodies were pristine, save for a small, precise puncture wound, almost surgical in its neatness. There was no blood on the ground, no spatter, nothing to suggest a struggle. It was as if their life had simply been siphoned out. My training offered no explanation. I considered a predator, but no known animal hunted with such chilling precision. A human? The thought was even more terrifying.
One evening, as dusk was bleeding the last color from the sky, I was making my way back to the cabin when I saw it. A flash of light, a flicker, a vibrant, impossibly orange red through the trees ahead. It was too low to be a star, too steady to be a firefly, and too bright to be a lantern. It hung there for a heartbeat, and then it was gone. I froze, my rifle raised. The forest was silent, but in my ears the blood was a roaring torrent. I waited, holding my breath until my lungs burned. Nothing, just the slow descent of night. I dismissed it as a reflection, a trick of the fading light. But my hands were shaking as I locked the cabin door behind me.
I spent that night poring over old books I kept in the cabin, dog-eared collections of local folklore and strange tales. I'd always considered them a curiosity, a window into a more superstitious past. But now, they felt less like history and more like a field guide. I found it in an old leather-bound book about regional myths, a section titled The Braxton County Horror. The account was from 1952, a report from a local newspaper about a sighting in Flatwoods, a small town a little over 100 miles from my post. A group of children had seen a strange, tall creature with a glowing, dome-like head and a dark, pleated body. It was described as hissing and leaving a lingering chemical smell in its wake. They called it the Flatwoods Monster, or sometimes the Braxton County Monster. A shiver ran through me that had nothing to do with the cabin's chill. The descriptions matched. The domed head, the pleated body, the hissing sound, the smell. A chill went down my spine. The forest wasn't just holding its breath, it was waiting for something to make its move.
I told myself it was coincidence, a fever dream. I tried to focus on the logical, the empirical, but the forest was different now. Every shadow was a threat. Every creak of the cabin floorboards was a footstep. I felt like a stranger in my own home. My duty, my training, told me to investigate, to find a rational explanation, to protect the land and those who used it. My gut, however, screamed at me to run. My shortwave radio was now just a box of static, my satellite phone a useless brick. I was cut off, and I was trapped.
The climax of my horror came 2 nights later, on a patrol I should never have taken. The radio was dead, the static a maddening hiss of nothingness, and I couldn't get a signal on my satellite phone. I needed to check the relay station on a nearby ridge, a 10-mile round trip, and my duty, that ingrained part of my being, won out over my fear. I had to know. I had to see it, to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind.
I set out before dawn, the air heavy with moisture and the metallic smell. The familiar trail was now a gauntlet of shadows. The morning mist felt less like vapor and more like a living thing, reaching out to grab me. I kept my rifle at the ready, my senses on high alert. I was a man of the woods, a hunter, a protector. I would face this thing head on, and I would prove it was nothing but a story.
It was in a small clearing, near a stand of ancient hemlocks, that I finally saw it up close. Not a flash of light, not a shadow, but the full, terrible form of it. It was easily 10 feet tall, a dark, spindly figure that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its head was a pulsating dome of light, a searing, eye-watering orange red that pulsed with a life of its own. It was not a head in the traditional sense, but a singular, glowing orb that sat atop a narrow, elongated neck. From its shoulders, a body of layered, metallic-looking material hung down, resembling a grim, pleated skirt. There were no arms, no legs I could see, just this towering, impossibly strange shape.
It didn't move. It simply stood there, a terrible, silent sentinel. A low, guttural hiss, like steam escaping a valve, filled the air. My blood turned to ice. My mind screamed at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The ozone and sulfur were overwhelming, burning my nostrils and making my eyes water. The heat from the glowing dome clashed with the cold morning air, creating a shimmering distortion around the creature's form.
I raised my rifle, my hand shaking so violently I could barely hold the sight steady. The monster's light intensified, and I could feel the heat on my face. It was as if it was drawing power from the very atoms of the air. This wasn't a deer, a bear, or a man in a costume. This was something fundamentally wrong, a tear in the fabric of the natural world I'd sworn to protect.
With a primal scream that was more animal than human, I fired. The shot cracked through the heavy air, a sound so loud it seemed to tear a hole in the silence. The bullet hit the pleated body, and I saw a flicker, a brief spasm of light. But the creature didn't flinch, it didn't fall. The hiss intensified, a mocking, triumphant sound, and then it began to move. It glided. That's the only way I can describe it. It didn't walk, it didn't run. It simply moved forward. A silent, terrible ballet of a thing that had no business being in this world. The pleated body flowed with a weird, unnatural grace. The domed head glowed brighter, and from within its depths, 2 smaller crimson lights appeared, like malevolent eyes. I turned and ran. Not with the practiced, steady gait of a ranger, but with the panicked, stumbling terror of a man fleeing for his life. The hissing was right behind me.
I could feel the heat on my back, a wave of pressure that pushed me forward. I used my knowledge of the terrain, crashing through thickets of rhododendron, leaping over fallen logs, scrambling down a steep embankment that led to a narrow creek.
I could hear the monster behind me, a rustling that wasn't right, a sound like a great, heavy silk cloth being dragged over the uneven ground. I splashed through the creek, the cold water a temporary shock to my system. I scrambled up the other side and kept going. The image of those crimson lights burned into my mind. I was a man of the woods, a man who knew these trails like the back of his hand. But this thing moved with a kind of terrible certainty that was far beyond human.
I found a small cave, a dark, damp fissure in the rock face that I'd passed 100 times. I scrambled inside, deeper and deeper until I couldn't see anything. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, and I could hear the frantic drumming of my own heart in my ears. I crouched in the absolute blackness, my body trembling, my rifle clutched tightly in my hands. The sound of the hissing faded, replaced only by the dripping of water from the cave ceiling.
I waited. For hours, I think. I lost track at time. The primal fear was still a living thing in my chest, but the exhaustion was starting to set in. My mind, in a desperate attempt to find a sense of normalcy, tried to convince me that it was over, that I was safe.
Then, a sound that was not dripping water. A scraping, shuffling noise from the cave entrance. It was a low, methodical sound, like something impossibly large was squeezing itself into the narrow opening. My breath hitched in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, a futile gesture against a horror that was already etched in my mind.
The scraping stopped. The silence returned. But it was a different kind of silence, a silence that was heavy, expectant. The hissing sound, low and guttural, returned, but this time it was right there, in the darkness with me. The ozone smell was so strong I could almost taste it. My lungs burned, the air grew warm, and then a light.
Not the domed orange-red light, but the two crimson pinpricks, the malevolent eyes that had stalked me through the forest. They were floating in the darkness, growing steadily brighter, moving closer. They were the last thing I saw. I did not scream. I did not fight. There was only the dawning realization of what this thing was, and that it had found me. The terror wasn't in the hissing or the scraping or the cold light of its eyes. The terror was in the absolute knowledge that I had been wrong all along. My sanctuary, my cathedral, was never mine to begin with.